Hey YouTube, I'm back with another motherboard overview video. So in this one we're going to be doing an in-depth look at ASUS motherboards. So this is the last one that I'm going to be covering for the X670E series that I've done. Just like what I did with ASRock, MSI, and Gigabyte, I'm going to go over a entry-level price one. So in this case we're going to take a look at the TUF Gaming X670E Plus Wi-Fi model. And then we're going to look at a kind of a middle to upper end there in terms of the price. So this is going to be the ROG STRIX X670E Gaming Wi-Fi. This one's like a $500 motherboard. And then we're going to look at a flagship one or a Halo product. So this is going to be the ROG Crosshair X670E Hero. So there is also the Extreme, but we're not going to cover that because it's just the same. It's a larger version of this. So without further ado, let's go back to the TUF here. And what I'm going to do is you can go to the motherboard page and you can check the tech specs and kind of see like what it comes with. But what I'm going to do for you guys is I'm going to show you guys the block diagrams that I have come up with here, because I think this is going to be a lot more useful for those that are interested in either upgrading to the new AM5 platform and are on the fence of what motherboard to get. So as I've said in previous videos, it all depends on your use case. It depends on what you're going to be doing with the computer, and that's going to be the key determining factor. That along with, of course, the price point. So with the TUF, this motherboard is around $300. So yeah, it is still kind of pricey. ASUS tends to be on the pricier side in terms of the, what you get, essentially. So this is why I haven't really covered ASUS that much in depth, because there's two things. One, they tend to be very expensive, even at the lower cost options relative to other brands. And the other reason why I don't really cover them that much is because I don't like their documentation. I think it's the worst out of all of the motherboard vendors. ASUS's documentation in terms of the manual really lacks the block diagram, which makes it a lot harder for someone who's looking to buy a motherboard, having to sift through pages and pages of documentation, and then they're not able to find a block diagram that easily lays out where everything is connected, whether it's going to the chipset and how it's actually allocated. So I've gone ahead and derived the block diagram based off of all the info in not just the spec page online, but also the manual. So this is kind of what I came up with. This is a rough, you can call this an unofficial block diagram, because it's not the official one, obviously. I made it myself, but I do think that it does cover all the bases in terms of the lane allocation. So this first one here is the TUF. So this being an X670E motherboard, all X670E motherboards will feature the full 24 lanes of PCI 5.0 bandwidth. You have additional lanes that go to the chipsets between here and here. So if you add 24 plus these 4, that's how you get the 28 number for the 24 total PCI 5.0 lanes. But the chipset is going to be 4.0. So anything that's down here is going to be 4.0 or 3.0, depending on what we're looking at. So for the CPU, you get 24 lanes of Gen 5. You also get a display port and an HDMI port for the integrated graphics on the CPU there. All these new Ryzen CPUs feature integrated graphics, so that's really nice. If you're not going to run a GPU, if you're just going to do like RAID and high-end storage and that kind of thing, then you would be able to put add-in cards, bifurcated cards into the 16 slot, and you would just drive your displays off of the integrated graphics. So that's always nice. It's kind of a new thing for these AM5 platforms. So the first thing you get is the X16 for the graphics cards. This is a 5.0 slot, so in the future, currently not with any graphics card on the market today, but in the future, potentially there could be a 5.0 graphics card that could make use of this slot. You also get a M.2 Gen 5 SSD slot, so that's 4 lanes. And then, I guess to keep costs lower, what ASUS has done is instead of giving you a second Gen 5 drive, they give you another M.2 drive, but it is only at Gen 4 speed. That is because if we go back to the motherboard, So you'll notice that down here, one of these M.2 drives is wired to the CPU. However, it is slower than Gen 5 because it's further away from the CPU. So rather than having to add a bunch of expensive read drivers and basically that regen the signal and keep the signal quality for PCI 5, they downgrade it to 4.0 speed. And that they do that as a cost-saving measure, and that's the reason why the Tough Gaming is a cheaper motherboard compared to something like a Crosshair Hero and that sort of thing. So that's worth noting. So you do only get a Gen 4, but you still do get two M.2 drives that go directly to the CPU. One is Gen 5, the other is Gen 4. So just keep that in mind. So that's going to take care of all of the CPU lanes. Moving on to the primary chipset. So all X670E motherboards have dual chipset design. So you have a primary and a secondary. So the primary one, again, if you total all the 4.0 lanes, you get 4, 8, 12. So that's 12 PCI 4.0 lanes, but because 4 of them go to the CPU and 4 of them go to the secondary chipset, you really only have 4 usable PCI 4.0 lanes. And what ASUS has done is they've given you a PCI 4.0 expansion slot that is wired for X4 speed, but it is physically an X16 slot, I believe. If we go back and look at the picture, well, let's see. So it's either going to be the bottom slot or the second slot. Either one of these is going to go to the primary chipset, and the other one is going to go to the secondary chipset, but they're both only 4.0 speed. See, it says X4, it says X4. So even though one of them is physically X16, it's really only an X4 electrically slot. So it could be either one. Without the true block diagram, I don't actually know which one is the X16, but regardless, they're both wired electrically as X4, so it doesn't matter. So one of them is going to be up here, the other one's down here on the secondary chipset. So that takes care of all the 4.0 lanes on the primary chipset. So moving on to the 3.0 bus, which does double duty as either a 3.0 bus or SATA. So what they have here is they've given you another M.2 slot, but this one is going to be a 3.0 M.2 slot, which does share lanes with 2 of the SATA ports. So what that means is if you populate this M.2_3 with a SSD, that will disable the first and second SATA ports. So you won't be able to use the SATA ports for storage. So that is kind of in my mind, it really kind of depends. Like if you're going to run a bunch of legacy spindle drives, like some big 8 terabyte drives or whatever for storage, then you're definitely going to want to run those on the SATA ports down here on the secondary chipset, especially if you plan to run a bunch of M.2 drives. If you plan to populate like all 4 of these M.2 drives, for instance, then keep in mind that you're really only going to have realistically 2 usable SATA ports on this Tough Gaming Wi-Fi. So that's kind of disappointing. I don't like when there's resource sharing like that, but that is just something to be aware of. So 2 of your SATA ports do share bandwidth with the M.2, and the M.2 drive does get priority, meaning if you have a drive connected in either of these, and then you go and connect an M.2 drive, what will end up happening is the motherboard, when you boot up the motherboard, it will detect the M.2 drive, so it will disable those ports. So you won't be able to access those drives in Windows, or whatever operating system, Linux or whatever. So just keep that in mind. So that's going to be the 3.0 bus on the primary chipset. So moving down to the secondary chipset. So the secondary chipset, just like the primary chipset, has 12 lanes of PCI 4. 4 of them go to the uplink to the primary, and the remaining 8 are your usable lanes. So what they have done on the Tough Gaming is, again, there is an X4 expansion slot, and then they give you a final M.2 drive that functions at PCI Gen 4 speed. So that's really nice. So one thing I do like about the motherboard is the inclusion of 2 X4 expansion slots. So what's really nice about this motherboard too is that it does support the Thunderbolt 4 header. So you can install an ASUS Thunderbolt 4 add-in card into this motherboard. You can plug that into either this slot or that slot, doesn't really matter. As long as you have the header for the control plane signaling going to the add-in card, it will work. So it's really nice to see Thunderbolt support on AMD from the motherboard manufacturers. More official now. It's not completely official because it's using USB 4 spec, but the fact that you can install an Intel JHL8540 controller via the ASUS add-in card, that's really, really nice. And then you, like, that would take up one of these, and then you would still have another one available for something like a 4K capture card or something along those lines, like an Elgato 4K or an AverMedia. I've done multiple videos on capture cards for, you know, capturing gameplay footage of like a PlayStation 5, for example. So if you have any questions about that, let me know in the comments. So finally, we have the remaining 2 SATA ports, and then you have Wi-Fi 6E and PCI, or not PCI, you have the LAN, the 2.5 gig LAN as the final lane. So the nice thing about the motherboard is every lane is utilized. There's nothing that's wasted here. The only drawback is this, just keep in mind that those SATA ports are sharing bandwidth with that M.2 drive. That's going to be it for the Tough Gaming Wi-Fi. So if we go back here now, so now we're going to look at the STRIX. So this one is a $500 motherboard. And this one looked really promising. Like when you look at it, like it looks really good. You look at the photos, it looks like it's got a lot of connectivity and everything. But when I started looking at the manual and reading up on the documentation, this was probably my least favorite motherboard that I looked into. And we're going to go over why that is. So the problem with the STRIX, and I'm specifically talking about the STRIX X670E-E gaming Wi-Fi, is that there's too much resource sharing, and I feel like it's unnecessary. So let's kind of break that down for those watching. So it being a X670E, you know, it's still the full 24 lanes. However, they do a lot of weird shenanigans with this motherboard. So they do give you 2 native Gen 5 drives that are permanently there. There's nothing shared, but they're doing something weird. So they have 2 X16 physical. You know, the typical top one's going to be X16, but as soon as you populate something in the second one, then they're going to run it. The primary will run at X8, but the second one will only run at X4. It will not run at X8. So you can't do something like a by 8 in the top and a by 8 in the second one. It will be by 8, by 4, and the reason why the second one is by 4 is because they've allocated the remaining 4 lanes that would normally make that run at X8 to another M.2 drive that they can advertise and run officially at Gen 5 speed. So they're able to market the STRIX as a, you know, up to 3 Gen 5 drives all to the CPU, which is true. Just know that as soon as you populate that third M.2 drive to the CPU, you're going to run the graphics card slot at by 8, regardless of whether you have anything in the second PCIe expansion slot or not. So just keep that in mind. So that's one thing I don't like about the motherboard. I dislike when they have a lot of resource sharing going on with the CPU lanes. So this is kind of something something that you encounter a lot, pretty much across the board on every single new Intel 13th Gen Z790 motherboard will all do this sort of thing with the M.2 drives. So that's why I don't really like how this motherboard allocates those CPU lanes. So moving on to the primary chipset, pretty straightforward. You get an X4 expansion slot. So this can be used for a Thunderbolt 4 add-in card or a capture card. So that's kind of the typical, most common use cases for this. You could also populate an add-in card for an additional M.2 drive for Gen 4 speed. But I don't really think a lot of people are going to do that because they already give you a bunch up here. So, and you could potentially put another one up here. So regardless of what you want to do, you could use this with a Thunderbolt add-in, or you could do this with a Thunderbolt add-in. Doesn't really matter. The header is on the motherboard though. All right, and then on the PCI 3.0 bus, you basically get all 4 lanes, one per SATA drive. So you get 4 SATA drives native there. So that's really good. It's pretty standard stuff. And then here's where this motherboard is really disappointing. So on the secondary chipset, they have a 4th M.2 drive that runs at Gen 4 speed. And then there's the LAN and the Wi-Fi. So each use 1 lane. That's totally fine. So that totals up to 6 lanes out of 8. So there's 2 lanes that, as far as I can tell, they're completely unused. And that's just really bad. In my opinion, that's just bad value. Considering the price point on this motherboard, you know, this is a $500 motherboard from ASUS, and there's unused lanes on the chipset. That's just a big no-no. In my book, you can't charge $500 for a motherboard and then have, like, just leave the consumer hanging with, you know, unused chipset lanes. And then the other thing, too, is the PCI 3.0, there's nothing going on over here. So they didn't. It would have been nice if there was another like expansion slot or something for, you know, an add-in card, or maybe give us 8 SATA ports. They literally could have wired up 4 more SATA ports down here, and for a total of 8, because, you know, last gen, you know, X570 boards, 8 SATA ports was pretty common. So that's really disappointing. So out of the 3 motherboards that I've looked at, this is my least favorite one, and this is the reason why, if somebody was willing to spend up to $500 on a new motherboard, I would definitely push them toward, you know, the ASRock Taichi, or the Gigabyte Aorus Master, or the MSI MPG Carbon Wi-Fi. I think those 3 are much better. They're all kind of in the same price point as this motherboard, but they're giving you much better value compared to this. So can't really recommend the STRIX for that reason. Unless there's something else that they're doing, unless there's an ASMedia controller for a USB 20 gig port. But as far as I can tell, there isn't one, because these chipsets natively, each of these, so there's one 20 gig port off of the primary, and they have another one for a front panel header on the secondary one. So they're already giving you that off of the chipset. But in terms of the PCIe lanes, you know, this just doesn't cut it. Like, that's unacceptable. So that's shame on ASUS for that. That's probably why they hide the block diagram. So anyway, let's move on to the final motherboard. So this next one is going to be the Crosshair Hero. So this is going to be the flagship. So I historically have been a big fan of the Crosshair motherboards. So I have a Crosshair, I think it's a Crosshair 5, Crosshair Formula Z. It's basically a 990 FX. It's for the AMD FX 8350. It's for the Bulldozer, the Vishera, Pile Driver, those CPUs. I have that motherboard. And then I also have the Crosshair 6, which was the original Crosshair 6 Hero for the Ryzen 1st gen. So that was like my main first Ryzen motherboard. And then I did also get the X570 Crosshair 8 Hero. So I have a number of ASUS Crosshair motherboards over the years. However, this one, I did sit this one out because this one is priced very high at $700. It's just too much. Like, you know, the most I will do is $500, and, you know, the STRIX wasn't good, so I went with the Aorus Master from Gigabyte this time around. Like, maybe the Ace from MSI, that's a really good one too. It's the same price as the Crosshair Hero. The only thing with the Ace is it does lack the Thunderbolt header. But what ASUS has done with the Crosshair in terms of Thunderbolt, they've done something really interesting here. Kind of like what ASRock has done with the Taichi. So let's get right into it. So with the Crosshair Hero, they unlike the STRIX, they really do use all the resources they can. So it does give you that dual, you know, you still get the dual PCIe slots, so you can run the top one by itself at X16, or if you populate the second one with something, then you're doing X8 and X8, which is pretty standard. That's something that has been really common on mainstream consumer motherboards for pretty much more than a decade now. But then you also get the 2 Gen 5 drives, so that's really nice, and there's no lane sharing, so it's, you know, everything's accounted for on the CPU lane side. So notice here, you do not get the DisplayPort. You get HDMI for the integrated graphics. However, what they have done is something very interesting. So what ASUS has done is they have taken what would be the DisplayPort, and they have done a wire trace internally on the motherboard down to what they have included here, which is an Intel JHL 8540 Thunderbolt 4 controller. So they actually include the Intel controller for the Thunderbolt 4 soldered onto the motherboard. So with this motherboard, you do not need to buy a Thunderbolt add-in card because the motherboard already has it embedded on the board. So what they have done is they've taken the DisplayPort signal and they have plugged it into what would have been a DisplayPort input on the Intel controller, and they have wired that internally to one of the 40 gig ports. So you get DisplayPort out for that one. They've taken a second one and they've also wired that up to the other one. So you get two, so you can technically drive 3 external displays with this Crosshair Hero motherboard. So that's really nice. Now keep in mind that this is going to be over USB-C, so you would need like a USB-C to DisplayPort cable or some kind of adapter to connect that up to a DisplayPort on a monitor. Unless you have a monitor that actually has a USB-C, but those are typically very expensive monitors and they're really rare to find. So that's really nice though. And then you can see down here on the primary chipset, you get an M.2 that runs at Gen 4, so that takes care of all those 4 lanes. And on the Gen 3 side, unlike ASRock, which wired this exact same controller up to one of these by 4 CPU lanes, ASUS has connected it to the chipset. So by doing that, they're basically keeping the exact spec as what Intel has specified, because the Intel Thunderbolt 4 controller does specify 4 lanes of PCI 3.0 bandwidth. So you only really need 3.0 bandwidth to drive the Thunderbolt 4 controller. You don't need 4.0, you don't need 5.0. So ASRock kind of did a little bit of an overshoot there because they wired it up to the 5.0 lanes on the CPU on their Taichi motherboard. So I do think that the Crosshair has done things a little bit more optimally. But you are paying $200 more for this motherboard compared to the Taichi. So, whether or not that's worth it remains to be seen. However, if we look at the secondary chipset, this is where things get really interesting. So the 3.0 bus is very straightforward. They've taken all 4 of those lanes and they've given you 4 SATA drives. So very straightforward. And then on the 4.0 bus, there's 8 lanes available. What they've done, one of them is a PCIe X1 slot. That's kind of disappointing. It's kind of useless, to be honest. But, at least it's something. You can connect like a 1080p capture card or something in there, like a legacy capture card. I don't really think, you can't really connect like 10 gig LAN because that's not enough lanes. But, it's just kind of there for whatever. You're not going to connect Wi-Fi because you already got Wi-Fi 6E on one of the other lanes. So your 2.5 gig LAN is there, Wi-Fi is there, so pretty standard stuff. You get your final M.2 Gen 4 drive, so you still do get the total of 1, 2, 3, 4 drives. 2 of them are 5.0, the other 2 are 4.0. And then what they've done here is they've taken the final lane and then they have connected it to an ASMedia controller, which then allows you to get 2 more SATA ports off of it. So that way they're able to give you 6 SATA ports as opposed to 4 SATA ports. Just know that I don't think you can do RAID. You can't RAID these other 2 as far as I know because they're on an ASMedia chipset, or they have to be on an ASMedia chipset for them to work that way. But everything's accounted for. The cool thing is you do get the 40 gig USB-C ports on this motherboard, and the way they're doing that is via the Intel Thunderbolt 4 controller. So it's basically Thunderbolt unofficially on an AMD platform, but it works. So this is kind of like sidestepping the additional cost of having to buy an add-in Thunderbolt card. You basically get it up front. So if this is something that you guys are going to find useful, it's there. Now, I'm expecting some people to ask about the ProArt Creator that ASUS sells, which is a $500 motherboard that they market for productivity and content creation. So that motherboard is very similar to this one. The only difference is they do not run those wire traces from the integrated graphics on the CPU to the Intel controller. Essentially what they do is they expose the DisplayPort input on the back of the motherboard, so you can plug in whatever you want for video pass-through. So that's the major difference between the ProArt and this motherboard when it comes to how they're handling that Thunderbolt 4 controller. So with that said, I think that pretty much covers it for ASUS X670E. If you guys have any questions, please leave a comment below. And if you like this video, please leave a like. It does motivate me to keep making more of these in-depth type videos that are more, more of like a deeper dive as opposed to your average sort of tech coverage or overview on a motherboard. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and get on out of here. And once again, thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Thanks.